October 15, 1975, East Berlin. Klaus Zimmermann, a 34-year-old factory foreman, stood frozen at his kitchen window, watching his neighbor, Herr Engelhardt, methodically photograph his family's laundry hanging on the line. What Klaus witnessed defied everything he thought he knew about life in the German Democratic Republic. Instead of the protective socialist brotherhood he'd been taught to trust, a vast network of surveillance surrounded every East German family. The metallic click of the camera shutter echoed across the courtyard like gunshots. Klaus understood with chilling clarity that even the most innocent daily activities were being cataloged, analyzed, and filed away by the State Security Service, the Stasi. This moment would mark the beginning of the most dangerous year of his family's life, as they began planning what millions of others only dared to dream about: escape to the West. Before we explore how this revelation changed everything for these families living under constant surveillance, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. We love hearing from viewers around the world who are fascinated by these untold stories of human courage during the Cold War era. The story begins 15 years earlier, when Klaus first arrived in East Berlin as an optimistic young man from rural Thuringia. Like most East Germans of his generation, he had been raised on the promise that the German Democratic Republic represented the future of human civilization. The state-controlled media proclaimed that while West Germans suffered under capitalist exploitation, East German workers enjoyed job security, free healthcare, and protection from the moral decay of Western materialism. Klaus believed these narratives completely. He married his childhood sweetheart Ingrid Bachmann in 1964, and together they moved into a modest apartment in Friedrichshain, convinced they were building a better tomorrow for their future children. By 1970, they had two young sons, Thomas and Michael, and Klaus had worked his way up to foreman at VEB Maschinenbau, a state-owned manufacturing plant. The Zimmermann family appeared to be living the East German dream, complete participants in what party propaganda called the construction of advanced socialism. However, beneath the surface of this apparent success, a different reality was taking shape. The Stasi, officially known as the Ministry for State Security, had grown into the most comprehensive surveillance apparatus in human history. By the mid-1970s, this organization employed over 91,000 full-time officers and maintained files on approximately 6 million East German citizens, nearly one-third of the entire population. What made the Stasi truly terrifying was not just its professional operatives, but its network of unofficial collaborators, known as inoffizielle Mitarbeiter, or IMs. These were ordinary citizens, teachers, shopkeepers, neighbors, even family members, who provided regular reports on their fellow East Germans in exchange for small privileges or simply to avoid trouble themselves. Conservative estimates suggest that 1 in every 50 East Germans served as an informant, creating an atmosphere of pervasive mistrust that penetrated every aspect of daily life. Klaus first began to understand the true extent of this surveillance network through a series of small, seemingly unrelated incidents. In early 1975, he mentioned to a coworker that he was frustrated by the constant shortages of basic consumer goods. The next week, Klaus was called into his supervisor's office and questioned about his negative attitude towards socialist construction. When he asked his 8-year-old son Thomas about school, the boy innocently repeated a teacher's instruction that children should report any anti-state conversations they overheard at home. Most disturbing of all, Klaus noticed that mail from his brother in West Germany, which had always arrived sporadically, had stopped coming entirely after he mentioned the correspondence to his neighbor, Herr Engelhardt. These experiences created a growing sense of unease, but it was the incident with the laundry photographs that finally shattered Klaus's remaining illusions about East German society. The revelation that his neighbor was systematically documenting his family's daily routines forced Klaus to confront a terrifying truth. They were living in a police state where privacy had been completely eliminated. Every conversation, every purchase, every social interaction was potentially being monitored and recorded. The realization was overwhelming. Klaus later wrote in his secret diary, which he hid beneath loose floorboards in their bedroom, "I never thought I'd say this, but we are prisoners in our own country. Everything we believed about freedom and security was a lie. We are watched, cataloged, and controlled like animals in a zoo." This awakening marked the beginning of Klaus's psychological transformation from loyal socialist citizen to potential defector. But it also initiated the most dangerous period of his family's life. The journey toward planning an escape began with careful observation and gradual information gathering. Klaus started paying closer attention to Western radio broadcasts, which were technically illegal but widely listened to throughout East Germany. Using a small transistor radio hidden in his workshop, he tuned in to RIS Berlin and BBC World Service during his lunch breaks, learning about life beyond the Iron Curtain. What he discovered contradicted everything he had been taught. West German workers enjoyed higher wages, better living conditions, and access to consumer goods that remained luxuries in the East. More importantly, they possessed something that Klaus was beginning to understand his family had never truly experienced: the freedom to make choices about their own lives. However, gathering information about potential escape routes proved far more dangerous than listening to Western radio. Klaus began making subtle inquiries among trusted co-workers, testing their attitudes toward the government through careful, indirect conversations. He discovered that many East Germans harbored similar doubts, but were too frightened to express them openly. The fear was justified. Attempting to flee the German Democratic Republic was classified as Republikflucht, a serious crime punishable by imprisonment of up to 8 years. Even discussing escape plans could result in arrest and prosecution. The Stasi maintained detailed files on citizens who showed signs of flight risk, including those who applied for travel visas, maintained correspondence with Western relatives, or expressed dissatisfaction with conditions in the East. Despite these risks, Klaus was not alone in his desire for freedom. Throughout the 1970s, thousands of East German families were secretly planning escapes, using methods that ranged from simple border crossings to elaborate schemes involving forged documents, hidden compartments in vehicles, and dangerous nighttime journeys through minefields and barbed wire. The most common escape route involved crossing into West Berlin, which remained officially occupied by Western powers, despite being completely surrounded by East Germany territory. However, following the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, this path had become extremely treacherous, monitored by guards with orders to shoot anyone attempting to cross without authorization. Klaus spent months researching different escape possibilities, using his position at the factory to gather intelligence about border security measures and transportation schedules. He learned that the Stasi had infiltrated most escape networks, making it dangerous to trust anyone outside his immediate family. The psychological pressure of maintaining this secret while continuing to appear as a loyal citizen was enormous. Ingrid later recalled in a 1990 interview with Western journalists, "We lived two completely different lives. During the day, we smiled, attended party meetings, and participated in socialist activities. But every evening, when we were certain the children were asleep, Klaus and I would whisper about our plans in our bedroom, speaking so quietly that we could barely hear each other. We were terrified that even the walls might have ears." The planning process required extraordinary attention to detail and months of careful preparation. Klaus understood that a successful escape would depend not just on choosing the right route, but on maintaining complete operational security within his own household. The family would need to continue their normal routines while secretly accumulating supplies, documents, and information. Any change in behavior that aroused suspicion could result in increased surveillance or immediate arrest. Klaus began making small, seemingly innocent preparations, gradually selling unnecessary household items to raise money, claiming the need for apartment reorganization, slowly gathering warm clothing and non-perishable food, explaining these purchases as preparation for a camping trip that never materialized, and, most dangerously, attempting to obtain falsified identity documents through a network of black market contacts. The document procurement process revealed the extent of underground resistance within East German society. Klaus discovered that a surprising number of citizens were involved in illegal activities ranging from currency exchange to document forgery. However, this underground network was also heavily infiltrated by Stasi informants, making every transaction extremely risky. Klaus later wrote, "Trying to find trustworthy help was like walking through a minefield. Every person who offered assistance might be genuine, or they might be setting a trap that would destroy our family. We had to evaluate everyone's motives while revealing as little as possible about our own plans. The paranoia was exhausting, but it kept us alive." By the spring of 1976, Klaus had developed a basic escape plan that involved traveling to a small town near the Czechoslovakian border under the pretense of visiting Ingrid's elderly aunt. From there, they would attempt to cross into Czechoslovakia and eventually reach the West German embassy in Prague, which had become a popular destination for East German refugees. However, implementing this plan required overcoming numerous obstacles, beginning with obtaining the internal travel permits necessary for domestic movement within East Germany. All citizens were required to register their place of residence with local authorities and obtain official permission for travel beyond their immediate area. The permit application process was designed to identify potential flight risks through a series of detailed questions about the purpose of travel, intended duration of stay, and contacts at the destination. Klaus understood that applying for permits to travel near any international border would automatically trigger increased scrutiny from the Stasi. To avoid suspicion, he decided to build a convincing cover story by establishing a legitimate reason for visiting the border region. Over several months, he arranged for Ingrid to begin corresponding with her elderly aunt, whom she had not contacted for years, creating a paper trail that would support their travel request. The psychological preparation for escape proved as challenging as the logistical planning. Klaus and Ingrid faced the agonizing decision of whether to inform their children about the escape plan. Thomas was now 10 years old and Michael was 8, old enough to understand basic concepts, but too young to fully comprehend the life-threatening risks involved. The couple agonized over this decision for weeks. If they told the children, they risked the possibility that the boys might inadvertently reveal the plan through innocent conversation with teachers or friends. However, if they kept the children ignorant, the boys might react with confusion or fear during the actual escape attempt, potentially compromising the entire operation. After extensive discussion, Klaus and Ingrid decided to gradually prepare the children without revealing the full scope of their plans. They began telling stories about relatives in West Germany, emphasizing how much they missed seeing family members who lived far away. They practiced emergency procedures with the boys, framing these exercises as games while teaching them to remain quiet, follow instructions without question, and trust their parents completely in unusual situations. Thomas, the older child, began to suspect that something significant was being planned, but he understood instinctively that asking direct questions was dangerous. Perhaps most devastating was the realization that escaping would mean abandoning everything they had built in East Germany. Klaus would lose his position at the factory, which represented 15 years of career advancement. Ingrid would leave behind her job as a primary school teacher, work that she genuinely loved despite the political constraints. They would abandon their apartment, furniture, family photographs, and personal mementos that represented their entire adult lives. Most painfully, they would likely never again see relatives and friends who remained in East Germany, as communication between East and West German families was severely restricted and closely monitored. The emotional weight of these sacrifices created periods of doubt and reconsideration. During the summer of 1976, Klaus temporarily abandoned the escape plan after learning that his elderly mother in Thuringia had developed serious health problems. The thought of leaving her behind felt like betrayal, particularly since he knew that his escape would result in harassment and possible persecution of family members who remained in East Germany. The Stasi routinely punished the relatives of successful escapees through job loss, eviction from state-owned housing, and denial of educational opportunities for their children. However, an incident in September 1976 finally convinced Klaus that escape was their only option for providing their children with a future worth living. 10-year-old Thomas came home from school visibly upset after being pressured by his teacher to report a conversation he had overheard between his parents. The teacher had explained to the class that good socialist children had a duty to help their parents become better citizens by sharing information about incorrect thinking at home. Thomas was confused and frightened by this request, instinctively understanding that something was wrong but unable to articulate his concerns. That evening, Klaus held his son and tried to explain, in terms a child could understand, that sometimes adults make mistakes about what is right and wrong. He assured Thomas that he never needed to report conversations from home and that his most important duty was to love and trust his family. After Thomas fell asleep, Klaus and Ingrid made their final decision. They would proceed with the escape plan, accepting all risks, because remaining in East Germany meant raising their children in a society that demanded they betray their own parents. The final escape preparations began in October 1976, exactly 1 year after Klaus's initial awakening to Stasi surveillance. The family had received permission to visit Ingrid's aunt in Görlitz, a town near the Polish and Czechoslovakian borders, during the first week of November. Klaus had carefully researched train schedules, border crossing points, and potential refuge locations in Czechoslovakia. He had obtained basic maps through library research and accumulated enough money to sustain the family for several weeks if necessary. 3 days before their planned departure, Klaus received devastating news that nearly destroyed their carefully laid plans. A co-worker at the factory, Werner Hagedorn, with whom Klaus had previously shared subtle criticisms of East German conditions, had been arrested by the Stasi on charges of planning an escape attempt. Werner had been interrogated for hours about his associates and had apparently mentioned Klaus's name as someone who might share similar sentiments. Klaus learned about Werner's arrest through factory gossip, but he understood that Stasi attention would now be focused on identifying Werner's contacts and potential co-conspirators. The news of Werner's arrest created a terrifying dilemma. Canceling their travel plans at the last minute would appear suspicious and might confirm Stasi's suspicions that Klaus was indeed planning something illegal. However, proceeding with the escape attempt while under potential surveillance could lead them directly into a trap. Klaus and Ingrid spent an entire sleepless night weighing their options, knowing that either choice could result in imprisonment or worse. In the end, they decided that the greater risk lay in remaining in East Germany under increased Stasi scrutiny. Werner's interrogation meant that Klaus would likely face questioning in the near future, and once the Stasi began investigating a suspect, they rarely abandoned their pursuit. The family would proceed with their escape plan, but they would need to be even more careful about avoiding detection during their journey. In the end, they decided that the greater risk lay in remaining in East Germany under increased Stasi scrutiny. Werner's interrogation meant that Klaus would likely face questioning in the near future, and once the Stasi began investigating a suspect, they rarely abandoned their pursuit. The family would proceed with their escape plan, but they would need to be even more careful about avoiding detection during their journey. November 3, 1976 arrived with the first frost of winter coating the windows of their Friedrichshain apartment. Klaus woke before dawn, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and anticipation. Today would determine whether his family lived the rest of their lives as free human beings or died attempting to cross one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world. He dressed quietly, checking and rechecking the small backpack that contained their survival supplies. basic medical kit, emergency food rations, warm clothing, and the forged identification documents that had cost him 3 months' salary. Ingrid was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee growing cold between her hands. They had agreed not to discuss the escape plan on this final morning, understanding that even their apartment walls might contain listening devices. Instead, they maintained the fiction that this was simply a family visit to elderly relatives, going through the motions of normal departure preparations while their minds raced with the deadly serious choreography they had rehearsed dozens of times. The children sensed the tension but responded differently to the charged atmosphere. Thomas, now 11, helped pack their suitcases with unusual seriousness, occasionally glancing at his parents with knowing eyes that suggested he understood more than they had told him. 8-year-old Michael remained cheerfully oblivious, excited about the prospect of seeing new places and meeting relatives he had never known. His innocent enthusiasm broke Klaus's heart, as he realized this might be the last morning his younger son would ever wake up without understanding the dangerous realities of the world they lived in. At precisely 8:30 a.m., the Zimmermann family left their apartment for the last time, carrying only 2 modest suitcases and appearing for all the world like any East German family embarking on a routine domestic trip. Klaus locked the door, knowing he would never open it again, leaving behind 15 years of accumulated possessions and memories. The hallway felt different somehow, charged with finality, and Klaus found himself memorizing details he had never noticed before. The worn spot in the carpeting near their neighbor's door, the faint smell of cooking cabbage that always lingered in the stairwell, the sound of children playing in the courtyard below. The journey to Berlin's Hauptbahnhof took place in almost complete silence, each family member lost in private thoughts while maintaining the appearance of relaxed travelers. Klaus had chosen their departure time carefully to avoid the morning rush when train stations were crowded with commuters and more heavily patrolled by transport police. Their train to Görlitz would depart at 10:15 a.m., giving them just enough time to purchase tickets and board without appearing rushed or nervous. As they approached the massive train station, Klaus felt the familiar sensation of being watched that had haunted him for months. Every uniformed official seemed to look at them with particular attention. Every fellow passenger appeared to be listening to their conversations. He reminded himself that this paranoia was probably psychological, a natural response to the stress of their situation. But the feeling persisted as they navigated through the crowds toward their departure platform. The ticket purchase proceeded without incident, though Klaus noticed that the clerk took slightly longer than usual to process their travel documents. The man examined their identification cards carefully, comparing the photographs to their faces before stamping their permits with official approval. Klaus forced himself to remain calm, engaging in casual small talk about visiting relatives while his pulse hammered in his throat. After what felt like hours but was probably only 3 or 4 minutes, they received their tickets and directions to Platform 7. The wait for their train's arrival felt interminable. Klaus positioned the family near a newspaper kiosk where he could observe the platform while appearing to read the morning edition of Neues Deutschland, the official party newspaper. The headlines proclaimed new achievements in agricultural production and denounced Western imperialism, the same propaganda he had once accepted without question. Now, these familiar phrases felt like relics from another life, evidence of the intellectual prison he was finally attempting to escape. At 10:12 a.m., their train pulled into the station with a great hiss of steam and screech of metal brakes. Klaus felt a moment of profound relief as he realized they had successfully completed the first phase of their escape plan. They were actually leaving Berlin, moving toward the border region where freedom might be possible. However, he also understood that the most dangerous part of their journey lay ahead, in the border zones where Stasi surveillance was most intensive and the consequences of detection were most severe. The train compartment they had been assigned contained 6 seats, currently occupied only by an elderly couple who appeared to be traveling to visit family in Dresden. Klaus and Ingrid settled their children near the window and arranged their luggage in the overhead rack, maintaining cheerful conversations about their upcoming visit while carefully observing their fellow passengers. The elderly man was reading a technical journal about mechanical engineering, while his wife worked on a knitting project. They seemed genuinely disinterested in the Zimmermann family, but Klaus had learned not to trust appearances when anyone's true loyalties were impossible to determine. As the train pulled out of Berlin and began its journey southward through the East German countryside, Klaus allowed himself a few moments to contemplate the landscape passing outside their window. These were the fields and forests where he had grown up, the familiar terrain that represented his entire world until this moment. Rolling hills covered with the golden stubble of harvested grain, small villages clustered around church spires, and the occasional factory complex releasing white plumes into the gray November sky. It was beautiful in its own stark way, and Klaus felt a profound sadness knowing he might never see it again. The train journey to Görlitz would take approximately 4 hours, following a route that passed through Dresden and several smaller cities near the Czechoslovakian border. Klaus had studied this route obsessively, memorizing every station stop and calculating the timing that would be crucial for their escape attempt. Their plan called for disembarking at Görlitz as originally scheduled, spending one night with Ingrid's aunt to maintain their cover story, then departing early the next morning for what would appear to be a day trip to nearby Zittau, a small town that sat almost directly on the border with Czechoslovakia. However, the actual escape would take place during their supposed journey to Zittau. Instead of taking the scheduled bus that would return them to Görlitz by evening, they would slip away from the main road and attempt to cross into Czechoslovakia through a section of forest that Klaus had identified as being less heavily patrolled than the official border crossings. This part of the plan was based on information gathered from careful study of maps and discreet conversations with local residents during a reconnaissance trip Klaus had made 2 months earlier. The risks involved in this border crossing were enormous. The area was patrolled by armed guards who had orders to prevent unauthorized crossings by any means necessary. The border itself was marked by multiple rows of barbed wire, some of it electrified, along with motion sensors and floodlights designed to detect movement during nighttime hours. Even if they successfully crossed into Czechoslovakia, they would then face the challenge of traveling across that country to reach the West German embassy in Prague, where they hoped to request asylum. As the train continued its journey toward Görlitz, Klaus found his mind wandering to thoughts of what life might be like if their escape succeeded. He had heard stories from Western radio broadcasts about the opportunities available to East German refugees who successfully reached the West. There were programs to help them find housing and employment, language classes to help them adapt to different regional dialects, and most importantly, the freedom to make their own choices about where to live and what kind of work to pursue. Yet Klaus also understood that escape would not solve all their problems. They would arrive in West Germany as refugees with no possessions beyond what they could carry, no established social connections, and no immediately marketable skills that matched Western employment requirements. Klaus's experience as a foreman in an East German state-owned factory might not translate directly to equivalent positions in West German private industry. Ingrid's teaching credentials might not be recognized by Western educational authorities. They would face the challenge of rebuilding their entire lives from scratch, learning to navigate a completely different economic and social system. Most difficult of all would be the psychological adjustment to life in a free society. After spending their entire adult lives under East German socialism, where every major decision was made by state authorities, the prospect of taking complete responsibility for their family's future was both exhilarating and terrifying.
Klaus wondered whether he would be able to succeed in a competitive market economy, whether his children would be able to adapt to Western schools, whether Ingrid would be happy leaving behind the teaching career that had given her life meaning and purpose. These doubts had tormented Klaus throughout the months of escape planning, but he had ultimately concluded that any uncertainty about life in the West was preferable to the certainty of raising his children in a society that demanded they spy on their own parents. The incident with Thomas and his teacher had crystallized Klaus's understanding that East Germany was fundamentally incompatible with the kind of family life he wanted to provide for his sons. No matter how difficult the adjustment might be, freedom offered possibilities that simply did not exist under socialism.
The train began to slow as it approached Dresden, the first major stop on their journey. Klaus watched nervously as transport police boarded the train and began checking passengers' identification documents and travel permits. This was a routine procedure, but Klaus knew that any official scrutiny of their papers might reveal discrepancies that could expose their escape plan. He had prepared answers to likely questions about their travel plans, but successful lying to trained investigators required calm nerves and perfect consistency. When the police officers reached their compartment, Klaus presented his family's documents with what he hoped appeared to be relaxed confidence. The younger officer, who appeared to be in his mid-20s, examined each document carefully while asking routine questions about their destination and the purpose of their visit. Klaus explained that they were traveling to visit his wife's elderly aunt, who had been experiencing health problems and needed family support. This story was technically true, which made it easier to present convincingly, though Klaus omitted any mention of their actual intentions. After several tense minutes, the officers returned their documents and moved on to the next compartment. Klaus felt his shoulders relax slightly as he realized they had passed this first official checkpoint without incident. However, he also knew that more intensive scrutiny awaited them as they approached the border region, where security measures were designed specifically to identify potential escapees. The remainder of the train journey passed in relative quiet, with the family maintaining casual conversation, while Klaus continued to observe their fellow passengers and monitor the landscape passing outside their windows. As they traveled farther from Berlin, the countryside became more rural and less developed, with fewer industrial complexes and more agricultural areas. This was the East Germany that Klaus remembered from his childhood, before urbanization and collectivization had transformed much of the country's traditional way of life. As the train finally approached Görlitz in the late afternoon, Klaus felt his anxiety intensify. They were now in the border region, where Stasi surveillance was most comprehensive and the margins for error were smaller. Every decision from this point forward would have potentially life-threatening consequences, not just for him and Ingrid, but for their two young sons who had never asked to be placed in this dangerous situation. The train pulled into Görlitz station at 2:47 p.m., exactly on schedule according to the East German railway system's reputation for punctuality. Klaus gathered their luggage and herded his family toward the exit, trying to appear like any ordinary family arriving for a routine visit with relatives. The station was smaller than Berlin's Hauptbahnhof, but still busy enough that they could blend into the crowd of arriving and departing passengers. Ingrid's aunt, Marguerite Steinhauer, was waiting for them near the station entrance, looking exactly as Klaus remembered her from family photographs. A small, elderly woman with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing the practical dark clothing favored by East German women of her generation. Her greeting was warm but subdued, as was appropriate for someone who had not seen her niece's family for several years due to travel restrictions. The walk to Aunt Marguerite's apartment took them through the historic center of Görlitz, a medieval city that had somehow survived both World War II bombing and subsequent socialist urban planning relatively intact. Klaus found himself struck by the beauty of the old buildings and narrow cobblestone streets, architectural treasures that seemed to belong to a different world from the concrete apartment blocks that dominated most East German cities.
Aunt Marguerite lived in a small, two-room apartment on the third floor of a building that dated from the early 1800s. The apartment was spartanly furnished but scrupulously clean, decorated with family photographs and handmade doilies that spoke of a woman who took pride in maintaining traditional domestic standards despite limited resources. She had prepared a simple meal of potato soup and dark bread, apologizing for the modest fare, while explaining that meat had been difficult to obtain recently.
During dinner, Klaus and Ingrid carefully maintained their cover story about visiting family and enjoying a brief vacation from their responsibilities in Berlin. Aunt Margarita seemed genuinely pleased to have company and eager to share news about mutual relatives and local events in Görlitz. However, Klaus noticed that she occasionally glanced at him with a curious expression, as if sensing that something beyond a simple family visit had brought them to her door. After the children had been put to bed on improvised mattresses in the apartment's main room, Klaus, Ingrid, and Aunt Margarita sat around the small kitchen table sharing tea and continuing their conversation. The elderly woman began asking more pointed questions about their plans for the following day, expressing concern about their intention to travel to Zittau given the unpredictable November weather. Klaus realized with growing unease that Aunt Margarita might suspect their true intentions. Her questions seemed designed to test the consistency of their cover story, and her mention of weather conditions suggested she was familiar with the challenges of traveling in the border region. He began to wonder whether their carefully planned deception was transparent to someone who had lived her entire life in this area, where escape attempts were a constant concern for local authorities. The conversation continued for another hour, with Klaus becoming increasingly paranoid about every word and gesture. When Aunt Margarita finally suggested that they should all get some rest before their busy day tomorrow, Klaus felt simultaneously relieved to end the interrogation and terrified about what the morning might bring. As he lay awake on the narrow couch that would serve as his bed, listening to Ingrid's quiet breathing beside him and the occasional sound of his children shifting in their sleep, Klaus understood that they had reached the point of no return. Tomorrow would bring either freedom or catastrophe, success or imprisonment, life or death. The months of careful planning had led to this moment when everything would depend on courage, luck, and the hope that somewhere beyond the barbed wire and guard towers, a better life was waiting for his family. Years later, Klaus reflected on this period as the most terrifying week of his life, but also the most meaningful. The escape had taught him that freedom required not just desire, but extraordinary courage and careful planning. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall finally fell, Klaus returned to East Germany for the first time in 13 years to visit his mother's grave. The Stasi headquarters in Berlin had become a museum, and he was able to access his family's surveillance file, which documented their activities from 1975 until their successful escape. The file contained over 400 pages of reports from neighbors, co-workers, and even casual acquaintances, revealing the extent to which their lives had been monitored and analyzed. For the Zimmermann family, the lesson was both humbling and revelatory, that ordinary people could overcome seemingly impossible odds when driven by love for their children and an unshakable belief in human dignity. The risks they had taken represented more than a desire for material comfort. They contained the fundamental human need for freedom of thought, expression, and choice. Their story became one of thousands that demonstrated how the human spirit could triumph over even the most oppressive systems of control and surveillance.